Hey everyone. In this video, I'm going to start our discussion of polling and election predictions. So if we look back at the last couple of presidential elections, we see that polling was actually fairly successful in some elections to predict the outcome of the result prior to election day, right? So, for example, if you look back at the 2008 U.S. presidential election, of course, this was a historic election because it was the first, or it elected the first African American president. And as we know, of course, Obama won 52.9% of the national vote, so that's just the popular vote across the entire country. While John McCain, the Republican candidate, won 45.7% of the vote. And one thing that we can see if we can look at all the polls that have been conducted prior to the election day, we see here polling. Each individual data point is one poll result, trying to predict the popular vote for Obama and McCain. And we see that there's quite some variation, quite some fluctuation early on. But the poll averages overall tend to be fairly accurate as we get closer and closer to election day, right? So right before election day, the polling averages were quite close to the result of the actual election, right? So in that sense, at least for the 2008 election, the polls were a good predictor of what's going to happen on election day. 2012 looked fairly similar. Of course, this was the election that led to Obama's second term. He was reelected. It was with a smaller margin, 51.1% of the vote, and Romney, on the other hand, 47.2% of the vote. And it turns out that the polls were again fairly well. At least, I mean, they didn't predict exactly the percentage correctly, but again, at the as we kind of got closer to election day, they kind of got closer to the ultimate election result, right? So again, here we have another plot looking at the 2012 general election popular vote estimates in multiple surveys. And again, we see variation over time, but overall, in the end, as we get closer to the election, the predictions and the polls are fairly close to what is actually happening in the election, right? And then came 2016, and obviously 2016 was not an example where the polls were correct in predicting who won the presidential election. So I don't have a comparable graph for you, but there is a nice short article in the New York Times that I also will upload on Canvas that kind of describes what went wrong in polling prior to the 2016 election, because the expectation, of course, was according to the polls, that it seemed very likely that Hillary Clinton would win the election. And then it turned out in key states like Wisconsin and Michigan, where the polls predicted that Hillary would win, or was more likely to win, it turned out that Donald Trump actually won, okay? And there are a couple of reasons why the polls went wrong in that specific election. And some of those are discussed in that article. So, for example, one of the reasons was that some of the polls that were conducted prior to the election didn't take into account people's level of education, and they didn't wait for education levels. But it turned out in that specific election, education was highly correlated with vote choice. Higher people with higher education levels were more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. And so by not taking that into account and not taking into account potential imbalances in the sampling with regard to education, if the polls sampled more highly educated voters than lower educated voters, they turned out to overestimate support for Hillary Clinton. Right, that's one of the issues. There are some other points in that are discussed in that in that short article. So do check that out, and we can also discuss that a little bit more in our Q&A session, right? So now, of course, that kind of there are problems with polling, but also this kind of raises a broader question of how we should ultimately forecast election results, right? Should we just focus on polling and trying to predict election results just based on polls that are conducted early before the election, or are there other factors that we should take into account, right? And so there are some other examples of people who work on electoral forecasting. Here, for example, Ericsson, in a paper that was published in 2014 that focus on other aspects, not only on polls, but rather focus on, for example, economic or other kind of fundamental conditions that should affect how well a presidential candidate and incumbent is doing. So, for example, what we see here is that there's kind of a positive relationship between perceived business conditions, so how people perceive the economy is doing, and support for the presidential party, so for the incumbent close to the election day, right? So there's a broader argument that can be made to what extent campaigns kind of flesh out how this relationship between these fundamentals and presidential support, and there's some interesting papers that kind of make this argument that campaigns are important in kind of informing the citizens about economic conditions and things like that. But the underlying question is, right, should we just focus on the polls, or should we maybe instead focus on these more fundamental macro political and economic characteristics that might help us at least predict support for the incumbent party? And so recent methods, and one of the forecasts that I showed you last week, and that we're going to talk about more this in the videos that I'm going to post this week, they kind of combine these fundamental aspects like economic conditions and polling in order to provide a more accurate prediction, right? But for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to analyze some polls, right? We're going to leave out the other kind of fundamental questions of the economy and things like that. And we're just going to take a lot of polls and see to what extent we can aggregate those polls in order to come up with a prediction for this upcoming election, which is coming up pretty soon. And if you're eligible to vote, if you haven't done so already, definitely get registered to vote and find out if you can vote absentee and all these things. So we will actually analyze some recent polling results. I downloaded some polls yesterday, and we're gonna go through some of those results and see what the current prediction will actually look like, right? And we will specifically we will use the polling data from the election forecast published by The Economist that I mentioned last week. And I really like this project. I really like the way they kind of present their forecast and also kind of convey the uncertainty around their predictions. And the nice thing is also that they make their code available and they make their data available. So if you go to the actual website that I showed you last week, we see here a little overview. We see that the model thinks that Joe Biden is very likely to beat Donald Trump in the Electoral College, around 9 and 10. That's the chance in winning the Electoral College, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about predicting the Electoral College in the next video. In this video, we're just going to focus on the popular vote and how we can basically aggregate these polling results, right? And so if you go through that website, if you haven't done so already, definitely check it out. There's some really interesting information and visualizations. And here we see kind of a polling average, and we see a similar graph where we have individual poll results. Of course, they use a slightly more complex model that take into account additional factors, outside of polling, and they take into account prior information. But what we will do is we will download this polling data, which you can do right here and take a look at yourself. I also uploaded it on I downloaded it already and did some minor cleaning, and uploaded it on our Studio Cloud. So if you follow this video, you can also directly log into our Studio Cloud and follow the code as well and look at these latest polling results yourself. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to download this here. If I click this link, we'll see, okay, downloading the data set. It's a CSV, so that's very nice. Now I'm just going to jump back to our slides because I prepared this data set right away. All right, so how is that going to look like? As I said, if you kind of looked at the file that I just downloaded, it has exactly this name, 2020 US presidential election polls, all polls.csv. That's the data file straight from the Economist website. And if we download this data and look at the structure of this data set, we see that we have right now, or as of yesterday, I should say, 1,207 polls included. So every observation is one poll result with 17 variables. We have information on the state, the individual pollster that conducted the poll, sponsor, start and end date of the poll. We have the number of observations, and most importantly, we have here support for Biden and Trump and the respective margins. So the difference between the predicted support for Biden and Trump, and some other information like the URL of the underlying data file and things like that. Okay. So, oops, yes. So the first thing we want to do is we want to kind of replicate these poll results, or visualizing these poll results over time and kind of look at the trend over time, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we want to compute the days to the election rather than just using the current date that is included in that data frame and count the days up to the election day and use that for to scale as the x-axis scale, right? So how are we going to do that? We have to, in order to do that, we have to deal with another data structure or type of variable that we haven't talked so much about, which is a date, variable. So just like we talked about numerics and strings or character values, there's also a specific date value where R knows that data in that format should be treated as a date, and that allows us to, for example, compute the difference between two dates to get the number of days between two separate dates, for example, right? And that's exactly what we want to do here, right? So what we do is we compute the difference between, of course, election day, November 3rd, and the end date of any given poll. So that's polls 2020 $end dot date. And we have to tell R, because as we read this in, if we go back to the previous slide, we see that here end date is a character vector, right? So it's not declared as a date, okay? So R doesn't understand, like right from the start, at least if we use this read.csv command, it doesn't understand right from the start that we're dealing with a date here, that 10 is the month, 9 is the day, and 2020 is the year, right? So in order to do that, we have to basically declare that this is as a date, that this is a date type. And then we want to, in order to do that, we also need to specify which format this, character string is currently saved in. And if we go back, of course, we see this is month, day, year. So this argument basically just tells our, okay, the variable is saved in a format where the first the first number is the month, the second number is the day, the third number is the year, separated with a forward slash, and then this will be recognized as a date variable, and we can subtract it from the election date to get the number of days to the election. And then the first thing we can do is we can just create a basic scatter plot, which means we're just going to look at, on the x-axis, the days to the election, and on the y-axis, we're going to look at Biden support in this case, okay, as well as Trump support, okay. Yeah, exactly. So the margin is then kind of the difference between both points, okay. A couple of other things we're doing, we're setting the labels for the x-axis and y-axis, setting the limits for both axes, and then the support for Biden will be in blue, and support for Trump will be in red, okay? And this kind of shows us kind of the picture similar to the previous plots that I showed you. But of course, there's a couple of things wrong with this. Ultimately, it's really, as we see, there just have been a lot of polls on any given day. So it's really hard to kind of make out, other than, seeing that, okay, the blue dots seem to be a little bit higher than the red dots. It's really hard to make out what the trends are in these data and how, things developed over time, right? So this ultimately is not an ideal visualization of polling results over time, because it doesn't really allow us very easily to evaluate the trends, okay? So of course, what could we do? Instead of having just a scatter plot with points, we could change the plotting format and change it to a plot where the type is now, where the type is now L, so we have a line plot. So rather than having dots, we just connect the data points as lines. Other than that, the commands are fairly similar. Oh, one thing I should also mention, right? We're creating the plot, the first initial plot, with support for Biden, and then if we look at the previous plot, we're adding additional points for support for Trump, right? So this is an additional command, points, that just adds points to, like, overlays them to the plot that we already created. If you go through this code on your computer, kind of first look at the results. If you just run the first line or the first lines of code, and then add the points command, and you'll see how the points are kind of just added to that to that plot, right? The same thing here, but here we're creating a line plot, and we're adding lines to that plot for Trump support, okay? And it turns out, if we do this, this looks even worse. This is the most unusable line plot that I've seen in a long time. And of course, in the next couple of slides, we will talk a little bit about how we can make this better. Right, the line plot here is completely chaotic. There's actually some connections that are being made because of the structure and the data that makes no sense whatsoever. And so this is, of course, completely unusable. So what we have to do is we have to take all those individual plotting, those individual polling results, and kind of find a way to create a kind of smoothed average over time. And that's what we're going to do next. But we're already at 20 minutes, so I'm going to take a break here, and in the next video I'm going to talk about smoothing those individual polling results over time.